Hello and welcome back to another Rush Duel Links video. Today we're going to be updating our tier list in the same way that we always do 2 weeks after a new product has launched. So 2 weeks is about the time it takes for a meta to kind of settle. Now obviously it could still evolve, things could still get shaken up, but about 2 weeks of results is enough for us to say, okay, these decks seem to be performing quite well, these ones seem to be performing a little weaker. So as we always do, the first thing we're going to do is head over to our spreadsheet so we can take a look at the results. And if we take a look at these pie charts, we can see that top 4 points, Psychic is definitely the big performer, followed by Bubble Error, Machine, SAR, which is 7's Axel Road Spellcasters, Cybur, Blue Eyes, and Royal Rebels. If we expand that over to top 8, suddenly it's looking very similar, but the Blue Eyes part of this chart is looking a lot bigger, and we do have a few more decks in there, such as the Noodles. So the pie charts are a good visual representation of what's going on, but I think the table is kind of a better, let's look at the numbers, let's dig in a bit deeper and see what's going on. So first up, top 4 points, Psychic is more than double the second place deck, being Bubble Error. So Psychic is definitely head and shoulders performing above the other decks right now. If we look at top 8, we're seeing something similar, where it's performing almost 3 times as well. Now, there is going to be some caveats to this. Psychic is a very popular deck, and with the deck suddenly having all of these new tools and actually being competitively viable, we are seeing a lot more players pick up the deck. So just by the fact that more people are playing the deck, that does increase the deck's likelihood of topping events. But the deck still does have to pull its own weight to actually make it to that top 4, top 2, or top 1 finish. As we can see by the number of tournament wins, Psychic has also won the most tournaments with 2. So I think it goes without saying that Psychic does at the very least deserve some respect. I've seen some people saying that Psychic is now a tier 0 deck. I've seen people say it's like top of tier 1. I personally don't subscribe to that. I think realistically, the deck still does brick. It's not infallible. It's not this overwhelming force that can't be defeated by other decks. In fact, quite oftentimes you'll open a hand that's just completely unplayable and not be able to do anything with it. So I think calling it tier 0 does seem a little bit hyperbolic. Tier 1 though is definitely up for debate. If not, it is definitely top of tier 2. It's definitely performing well. Bubble Error as well is a deck that has been performing quite well. If we were to take just the top 8 into account, then it's basically tied with Blue Eyes. Blue Eyes is a deck that again does see a lot of representation and has been performing to a decent degree, but hasn't really been able to convert that into top 4 positions. Although we have just seen it win its first tournament, so we might see an uptick on Blue Eyes overall. Machines are still trucking along. We didn't really see much out of Machines for the first week, but after the second week we have seen Machine kind of come back with a vengeance, especially taking first and second positions at Quantum Rush 31. SAR is almost the opposite. SAR started strong and seems to have fallen off as we've gone on, so it'll be interesting to see if SAR does manage to keep up. Cybur has kind of been floating around. It hasn't really improved or gotten worse. It's just kind of always been around. It's kind of doing its own thing. And then a lot of the other decks, we don't really have that many results to talk about. So after looking at this data, the first thing we want to do is go and take a look at our old tier list. This was the last tier list that we came up with, and this is the one that's going to be updated and kept on the spreadsheet. So again, if you want to see our up-to-date tier list, that's always going to be on the spreadsheet, and link to that will be in the description and over on our Discord server if you ever want to find it. All of the latest stuff that we post is always going to be over on Discord. So we had Machine and Cybur as our tier 1 decks, and these are probably still 2 of the strongest decks in the game. We had Royal Rebels, then Magnum Overlord, Ice Sark, SAR, and Worms. All of these decks are very powerful, and they either won a tournament or got very, very close to winning tournaments, so they're all performing very, very well in the previous meta. And then everything after that was kind of, it was in the meta, it was doing okay, but it was kind of the top 8, kind of the fringe decks that were doing relatively okay, but realistically these weren't like popping off, these weren't really winning big events. So when it comes to making the tier list itself, we don't have a ton of data to go off, but we do have just enough. First off, we're going to take a look at Noodles. Noodles has gotten a top 8 position. Realistically, it hasn't really changed. It hasn't really gotten stronger. It hasn't even really gotten weaker. It's just kind of exactly where it was before. So we're going to leave it in tier 3. I think that is a sensible place for it. But this could go up or down. I would more realistically expect it to go down rather than going up, but I guess you never know. Noodles, after getting their nerf, have really struggled to really find any kind of footing. It has placed okay. Realistically, Noodles' best performance was taking both second and third place during an Angel Cup, But again, there is always an asterisk attached to these sort of things. That was a week when a lot of the notable named players did not show up to play. There was also a lower player count in that tournament overall, which means a lot of these fringe picks did get to kind of sneak in, as well as the fact this was when we were very, very deep into the last meta, and people were kind of getting bored of just playing Machine and Cybur in every single game. I still think this deck is okay. It still has some strengths, being able to burn your opponent, being able to get that draw, but the skill getting that nerf and having the extra spice put on the limit 3 list really did hamstring this deck, and it's now a shadow of its former self. Next up we have Magnum Overlord, and I think this realistically is also going to be a tier 3 deck. Now this does feel a bit weird because Magnum Overlord has been a tier 2 deck for the longest time, and did actually win a tournament not too long ago in the previous meta. But this meta so far, it hasn't really accomplished very much on its own. We're still kind of waiting to see this deck be innovated on, and the problem is we're not really seeing any new cards that we can use to make this deck feel any stronger than it already was. A lot of people have already kind of sussed this deck out, and obviously it is going to be a lot weaker into any deck that is allowed to play negate attack, which is most decks in the format. That being said, we have just gotten 2 new decks that cannot use negate attack. Well, they can, but they have to sacrifice something else for that. That being Psychics and Aqua, who both have a limit 2 card in Jampy Check and Seahorse Carrier. But I think there still is a lot of potential for this card to really pop off in the future and possibly jump up to a tier 2 deck. Then we have one of our newer decks. So this is Blue Eyes, which is going to represent Blue Eyes Monarch, because that is the deck that is performing right now. Realistically, the non-Monarch version is doing absolutely nothing, hasn't really done anything for months and months and months. So this is the Blue Eyes Monarch deck, which has, like we said earlier when we were looking at the data, won its first tournament and has performing very well in top 8s. That tells me this deck is seeing a lot of representation, but is not converting that into top 4, top 2, or top 1 positions particularly often. I still think though the deck does deserve a bit of respect. With the ability to keep summoning out our Will Hells, which are our Monarchs, we're able to punish our opponent for leaving a lot of resources on the field. If our opponent is playing very, very few resources, so decks such as Machine come to mind as a deck that doesn't really get to usually end on like 6 cards on the field, the Mega Will Hell can really punish that by forcing your opponent to send one of their very few resources to the graveyard. So realistically, I think that Blue Eyes Monarch is one of the stronger decks right now, but I don't think it is tier 1 material just yet. Next up, we're going to talk about Seven's Axel Road, and this deck, I think, was performing very well in week 1, has since fallen off a little bit since then. So this deck still could rise back to full height, but for now, we're going to leave it in about, I think, the middle of tier 2 feels about right. Seven's Axel Road basically does what it's always done. It has got a new tool in the Seven's Road Sorcerer, which does let you basically play the deck on a different axis. Basically, before, the entire game plan was get a 6 into hand, get the 6 out, use the skill, boost the 6 by 800 attack, grab out the Seven's Road Magician from deck, slam it down, slam down another monster, boost everything's attack, and try and just get as much damage in as possible, and ideally do that 1 or 2 more times to completely kill your opponent. The deck now can also set up the graveyard by getting SRM and SRW into the graveyard, then using Seven's Road Sorcerer to bring them back from the graveyard, which does mean we don't have to be entirely reliant on just finding one of those 1600 attackers. So the deck does definitely feel stronger than it did before, but it's still got the same game plan. It still feels that the deck has the same ceiling. It's just the deck now feels a bit more consistent, which is a really good buff. Next up, we have Aggro. Aggro, once again, is a deck that really hasn't been seeing much play. The deck is obviously still strong. The deck plays Dragius. Dragius is still an amazing boss monster. But a lack of real skill, I think, is really holding this deck back at this point. I think the meta has reached a point where not having a really good skill is really a big detriment that it's hard to kind of gloss over at this stage. I think it's still a tier 4 deck. I don't think it's going to suddenly disappear from the meta. I think still people are going to bring this to tournaments, and it's sometimes going to do okay, but we haven't been seeing this deck top pretty much at all anytime recently. When this deck does eventually start topping again, which I'm sure it will eventually, even if it's only top 8 positions, we might bump up a little bit, but I think tier 4 does seem fair for now. And then we're going to talk about Resonance. So this is a deck that did get a top 8 finish. I would say that this is a rogue deck. This is a deck that has some really good matchups. Some decks really struggle to deal with the Resonance for 2 reasons. First off, Resonance is very good at popping your opponent's back row, which for some decks that do rely on their back row quite heavily can be quite detrimental. Off the top of my head, I'm thinking things like trap-oriented decks, such as Mighty Gaze of the Sky Emperor or Noodles, or even Trap Royal Rebels, so there are quite a few decks that do revolve around that. As well as the fact this deck can create really high-level monsters using its skill, which means again, a lot of trap cards that only work on low-level monsters like 8 and lower do not affect this deck, which can be really frustrating for some of those decks. So this is definitely a rogue deck. It has some really strong matchups, but overall does feel a little bit lacking. And talking about another rogue deck, we do also have our Mirror Geas, and this is going to represent, I guess, primarily Gear Strike. This is a deck that, on paper, kind of is okay, right? Now, the negative of Gear Strike is really bad. Only being able to inflict half damage with your Dark Dragons is a pretty big detriment, but this deck is very good at clearing up level 7 decks. The issue is, not every deck in the game is a level 7 and under deck. A lot of the decks in the meta right now are 8-axis decks, such as the Blue Eyes White Dragon that is right here. And any of these level 8 decks are going to have a massive advantage going against the Mirror Geas. So I don't think the Mirror Geas deck is super terrible, but I think it's safe to say it's not in a great spot overall, but it does have some incredibly good matchups. It's just those matchups are very few and far between, which is why I think Rogue is exactly where this deck belongs. Next up, we have Cybur. Cybur is a weird one. This has been a tier 1 deck basically since Chaos Femtron came out, but recently its tournament results have been a little bit lackluster. So I think it's actually fair to bump this down to the top of tier 2. Now again, being demoted down to a tier 2 deck does not mean it's suddenly bad. It doesn't mean I'm saying this deck is now awful. I'm not even saying anything bad about this deck at all, other than it has not been performing as well as it has done in the past. I realistically think the difference between the rush tiers is actually very minor. I think the difference in speed tiers might feel a little bit more impactful, like a tier 1 versus a tier 2 deck is going to be like a big drop off. In rush, I really think it's little tiny bits. So I think the tier 1 decks are going to be a little bit stronger, but not overwhelmingly dominant over the tier 2 decks, so I think tier 2 is an okay place for Cybur to be. The deck still does what it's always done: reduce your opponent's monster's attack, get out your boss monsters very easily, still be very susceptible to having low defense monsters, which means you get punished by both monsters being changed to defense and pierced over by things like Innovator, as well as things like Shield and Sword. And then the Boogeyman himself. I think it's safe to say Machine is still a tier 1 deck. Again, we haven't seen this perform as well in this current format, but it is still early days, and this deck is still performing reasonably well. Mirror Innovator is just such a strong card that it is really difficult to dethrone it. Just having easy access to huge attack gains and piercing is always going to be really powerful, and the skill just lets you fix any bricked hands, which is such a powerful skill, which I think a lot of people have underrated up until now. Next up, we have Worms, and Worms is a deck that has won a grand total of 1 tournament since coming out. This has just gotten some new support. That new support is fine. Realistically, the deck hasn't really changed in its game plan. We still want to either play the Mighty Gaze version to change our opponent's monsters to face-up attack and then attack over them with our maximum, or we want to play the Maximum Excavator skill. Still does what it's always done: get your maximum out, amass a big hand, eventually get your deck to 10 or less cards, and then start attacking over your opponent's monsters. So still very good. Does have a few weaknesses, again, like the low defense values has always been a big problem with this deck, and it does have quite a reliance on field spells, but the deck is still solid, and I think tier 3 is a strong placement. Next up, we have Aqua, and I think Aqua has proven itself to be quite a dominant force. Now, Aqua is another one of those decks that did perform very well week 1. It's still performing well week 2, but a little bit of a noticeable drop-off, so I think middle of tier 2 feels about right. The deck is very competent. It's able to relatively easily summon out multiple 2500 attack monsters. We're also able to make boards that are able to break our opponent's boards relatively easily. We're also able to take cards out of our opponent's hand and boost our own life points, and boosting our own life points can be very good depending on the matchup we are in. Obviously, more life points is always going to be good, except maybe against something like a Magnum Overlord deck that isn't going to care about it. But some decks really struggle to kill your opponent when they have 8,000, 9,000 life points. We're talking things like the 7's Rogue Magician, we're talking things like the Noodles. There's just some of these decks just can really struggle to get through. I would say the Aqua deck now is relatively consistent. We have good ways to get boss monsters back from the graveyard with Shoulder Foam Nian Nian. We have Fashion of Faith, which is able to plus us as well as boost monsters' attack. The deck just all around seems quite solid. The only real negative I could say is this deck doesn't have a great way to deal with maximum monsters and does have to rely on TSA and Tribute to the Doomed. Next up we have Vulcan, and Vulcan is a deck that I think slots into tier 4 quite nicely. This is a deck that was doing quite well on release and has since not really accomplished much. Sort of like Aggro, it hasn't really been showing up that much at all, so I think dropping it down to tier 4 does make sense. The deck is still okay, it's still fine, it's just until it starts performing a little bit better, I think tier 4 seems like a solid spot. The ability for this deck to burn your opponent is still quite relevant, but in the current meta, I feel like it's getting a little bit outpaced. 3400 attack on a maximum is also quite low, which means a lot of the other decks can just boost over that and attack over and kill it. And with a deck that gains life points in the meta, it also does mean that it can be a bit of a struggle to burn your opponent to death with this card. Next up we have Ice Arc, and Ice Arc is another very interesting deck. This deck plays a lot like the 7's Axel Road deck, where you basically just play relatively defensively until you're able to make your big push. That big push being summon out ideally a warrior monster plus an Ice Arc. Ice Arc effect brings back a warrior monster from the graveyard. Ideally have 3 big guys, slam into your opponent and try and get a load of damage in. The benefit of the Ice Arc deck is that you have access to Piercing Samurai, which means getting that damage through set 3 pass is very doable. And once we use our skill, we do get some of those bricks out of the deck and throw them into the graveyard, and then they'll basically stay in the graveyard, because every time we put them back into our deck, we'll just be sending them straight back to the graveyard, which means effectively we're not playing those 7 high-level monsters that we start the game with. The big negative of this deck is going to be, if we open a hand with a lot of double tribute monsters, there's nothing we can really do about it, we have just kind of brick. So this can be a little bit of a bricky mess, which is why we're putting it to the bottom of tier 2 and no higher, but it's still a strong deck. The deck can still perform, and a lot of people do underestimate this deck in favor of things like the 7's Road. I do think 7's Road is stronger than the Ice Arc, but I still think Ice Arc is a really strong competitor in the current meta. And then we have Royal Rebel. Royal Rebel is still such a strong deck. The problem that Royal Rebel tends to have is that in order to build this deck, you have to go into so many different boxes, which means it can be quite expensive to build, as well as a lot of people don't enjoy the play style of this deck, and a lot of people don't enjoy playing against this deck. Basically, Royal Rebel, and more specifically Doom Metal, is very good at punishing your opponent for leaving a lot of monsters in attack mode, which in Rush is something you want to do all the time. So if we take a look at Royal Rebels, it basically has really strong outs to Cybur, to Aqua, to 7's Axel Road, to Blue Eyes, to Ice Arc. It has just outs to just all of these decks. Because basically, almost every deck in Rush wants to just summon 3 monsters and slap you as hard as they possibly can. Getting rid of your opponent's monsters, even if you don't get damage in, will still deny them resources for the following turn, which means it's always going to be advantageous to do so. Royal Rebel is a deck that gets to say, I'm going to punish you for doing that, take a chunk of your life points, and if I can deal with your back row, also kill you through it. So although this deck hasn't been seeing a ton of high-end representation, it is still an extremely dominant deck, and in the right hands is really a force to be reckoned with. And then we move on to Psychic, and I think we're going to place Psychic into tier 1. So Psychic is an extraordinarily volatile deck. And what do we mean by that? The deck can pop off, we can completely destroy our opponent, we can dismantle our opponent's entire board, we can use Jamp Check to look at their face downs, pop the one that we need to. If our opponent's got multiple face downs we need to get rid of, we can use Melody's effect to get rid of one of those. If they've got set 3 monsters, we can also use Melody to get those out of the way. In some situations, if our hand is built in just the right way, we can also use multiple Melody effects in a single turn to get rid of multiple face down cards, which is so strong. As well as the fact this skill, if we do find Candy, can let us add our Prima from our deck to our hand, or our Jamp up, which does help out in getting these big plays off and can increase the attack value of our monsters. Psychic can just make these absolutely ridiculous boards, use Prima, boost those boards to ridiculously high numbers, completely deal with your opponent's back row, and then just slap in for an absolute crap ton of damage. It's so good when everything goes right. But also everything could just not go right. You could just not find your candies, you could open multiple boss monsters in your opening hand, and you can't play the game. And when you're behind with Psychics, you're really behind with Psychics. The deck can feel a little bit vulnerable if we're unable to find a good start. Opening 2 boss monsters in the opening hand can be a death sentence depending on how aggressive your opponent is or what deck they're playing. Psychic monsters also don't tend to have very high defense value, which means if you're playing against machines, for example, and they do just open Mirror Innovator, they can get some big damage in immediately and basically kill you on turn 3 or 4 before you've really had a chance to do anything just because you drew quite poorly. So this deck, on a good day, is unbelievably powerful. If you draw the God Hand, I feel like Psychic is almost unbeatable, but If you don't draw the God hand, or if you draw a very mediocre hand, suddenly the deck can feel a little bit weaker. Now, the deck does have a lot of consistency tools, and I think more often than not, we are seeing those good hands rather than we're seeing those bad hands, especially again because of those consistency tools. We're talking about things like the skill, which is just really, really strong. Being able to search a spell or a boss monster is always going to be really, really powerful. So I think a lot of people are saying this deck is overhyped, and I think that is still true to an extent. A lot of people are saying Psychic is just the best deck. They're saying it's tier 0. I don't think that's true. I think this is arguably the second best deck in the game. I think I could just as easily put it down here, and it doesn't really change anything. Like we said, the difference between the tiers is not very big. I think, though, that Psychic has proven itself to be a tier 1 deck. This could change going forward, but at the moment, I would say Psychic is performing well enough and winning enough tournaments that it deserves this place. Next up, Thunder. Thunder, again, is a deck we haven't really been seeing that much of as of late. I think it's still a solid deck. The deck is still able to summon out a bunch of bodies. We still have access to that piercing. And the deck still does have a really strong skill that can weaken your opponent's monsters as well as change monsters to defense. It is a really, really strong skill. I think it's still a solid deck. The deck is still performing okay, it's just not seeing anything at the tournament level as of yet. I think we'll leave it in tier 4 for now. We'll have to keep an eye on it and see where it goes. And I think that's kind of it for the list. We do have some other decks down there, but none of them are really in the meta right now. None of them really even feel like they're rogue. I think the 4-tier system plus rogue doesn't feel good for this meta right now. Any of the other decks down here either do have some potential, and we could see them going forward, but I've yet to see them perform in a tournament. I've yet to test them out myself, so I don't feel comfortable putting them on the list. Realistically, I think Red Eyes does have some potential with Red Eyes Monarchs. I think Dark Magician, again, does have some potential because we have got the Thousand Knives card now, as well as there are a couple of different ways to build this deck. I've also heard murmurings that the Volcano Attack Dragon and the Blaster's Inferno skill is doing okay in some matchups, so we will have to keep an eye on that one as well. But because, again, we haven't seen them perform in tournaments, we haven't tested them ourselves, we don't feel comfortable putting them on the list. Realistically, I think this, as I see it, is an accurate representation of the meta right now. I'm sure some people will vastly disagree with this. I'm sure some people are going to call me insane for putting Cyburs in tier 2. Some people are going to call me insane for putting Psychics in tier 1, and everything else in between. But I would love to hear what you think about this list and what you think is in completely the wrong place down in the comments below. So if you can let me know where you would put these decks, I would really, really love to know. I think having more information and getting a feel for what the community also thinks is always going to be really, really interesting, and I really do love reading about everyone's opinions. But that was the video. Hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you next time.